This is Darwin to Jesus. Welcome back to the channel. So a few days ago, my friend Nathan Bozeman and I recorded a deep dive response to Rationality Rules on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In his video, Stephen argues that the evidence for the resurrection, particularly the eyewitness testimony, is weak. After watching his video, we decided that a response to Stephen was well overdue. Throughout this video, there were instances that made it clear Stephen doesn't really understand the subject as well as he thinks he does. He uses very confident rhetoric, but once you start looking at the actual arguments and evidence, it becomes obvious that his arguments are actually very weak, and I expected more, frankly. Nathan and I think that by the end of this video, this will be clear to you as well. Also, if you enjoy this content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It really helps grow the channel. Now, enjoy the video.
Because he's basically rejecting the only kind of pathway to knowledge on this topic that he could even have, which obviously is absurd. Rationality Rules has kind of set up the standard where he's not going to accept testimony because testimony bad, and so he's not allowing for any evidence.
Either Jesus returned from the grave or he didn't.
Daniel, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing wonderful, Nathan. How are you?
I'm doing great as well. I'm really excited for this. I know that, Rationality Rules, he's one of those guys that has been on YouTube for, it feels like a decade now, making arguments against Christianity. And so I think it is about time that we address one of his arguments.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just so everybody understands why we're talking about this video, it's because there's a friend of mine who is familiar with my account, and he DM'd me and he said, "Hey, I saw this video." He's a Christian, and he said, "I saw this video by Rationality Rules, and it gave me a little bit of pause, and I think it would be wonderful if you could go over it and explain why he's wrong." And so I asked you, Nathan, if you would be interested in doing that with me, because I know that this is really where you're very, very strong, is when it comes to the resurrection evidence. So I really appreciate you doing this with me, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I definitely am excited to talk about this because, like you said, the resurrection is probably my favorite topic to talk about, just the evidence for it, and because I think it's just unbelievably strong, and Rationality Rules disagrees. So let's find out why, and let's get started.
There is one feature of the Christian faith which makes it radically different from every other religion.
Really? That's interesting. I'm all ears.
The resurrection.
Well, knock me over with a feather. The resurrection, you say? I guess Osiris, Horus, Buddha, Mithra, Krishna, and all the other divine beings who allegedly came back from the dead just didn't get the memo.
All right. We've got to talk about that, Daniel.
Yeah.
Did all these other gods rise from the dead?
No, so none of these gods had a bodily resurrection like Jesus Christ did. I went and looked it up. So Osiris, I'm going to go through the list of all five that he mentioned. Osiris had no bodily resurrection. He was reassembled by Isis, and then he became a ruler of the underworld. Horus had no resurrection at all. Buddha had no resurrection. He achieved para-nirvana, meaning that he left the cycle of rebirth, because Buddhists believe in reincarnation. So Buddha was able to get out of that cycle, which is literally like the opposite of a resurrection, because he didn't come back. Mithra did not have a resurrection, and Krishna did not have a resurrection. He was killed, and then he ascended, and then his body was cremated, and he didn't come back from that. So all of these gods that he just mentioned did not have a resurrection, and certainly didn't have a bodily resurrection. They all just kind of, if they had a resurrection, they came alive in the next world or something like that, but they weren't seen as a human or something like that in this world. So it's just incredibly ignorant. And I find that atheists do this all the time when they talk about Christianity, is they bring up a bunch of other gods that are silly, and then they try to basically conflate Christianity with all these other silly gods. So it's just a very cheap rhetorical tactic that I think needs to be addressed, because it shows how intellectually dishonest atheists are when they do this sort of thing. I also want to mention that Jesus, he died, and then he was seen again multiple times in the flesh by his followers, who are real historical figures. And these are people like James, Peter, Paul, John, and Matthew. We have their writings. These are real people. So this is very different than some kind of like ancient God myth or something like that. We have actual documents from these real people saying Jesus actually resurrected. So I think that that's worth mentioning. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing to say as well is the fact that there are no primary sources. And what I mean by primary source is if you look at the actual myths themselves that he's referring to, there are no primary sources that talk about a dying and rising motif in the way that Jesus did before Jesus, right? And, you gave those examples of what those dying, quote unquote, dying and rising gods were like, and it's nothing like Jesus, right? And so I think that it's really, really important to note that this quote unquote motif in the ancient world that Christianity is supposedly stealing from is just false. And this was popularized by James George Frazer at the beginning of the 20th century. He wrote a popular book, and it was basically, according to Bart Ehrman, exploded by Jonathan Z. Smith in an article called Dying Rising Gods in the Encyclopedia of Religion. So this idea that there was this really common motif of dying and rising gods in the ancient world, and Jesus was kind of just taking from that, has been totally debunked in the scholarly literature. And so I definitely think comments like this need to be put to rest.
Well, it's actually the opposite. It's even worse, because just so everyone is clear, it's not just that this motif of dying and rising gods wasn't popular at all, and it wasn't a thing until after Christianity. That's the thing. It became a thing after Christianity. So everyone else, if you do hear about a dying and rising God, that's because they were borrowing from Christianity, not Christianity borrowing from these other ideas. And I think that that's really important to say, because so often when you get into these conversations, that point is flipped, and you're told that there's nothing interesting about Christianity, and that Christianity just stole or borrowed from everybody else, and that's simply not the case.
Yeah. And I think this is something I've spoken about quite a bit. It's the fact that the Bible is always taken as guilty until proven innocent. And I think that this is something that needs to be put to bed, because the Bible has proven itself and vindicated itself time and time again through archaeology, through manuscript evidence. And so often people treat it as if it's guilty. Like, for example, there are some sections of Luke and Acts and Josephus that are similar. And so people just immediately assume, oh, well, that means Luke is written in the 2nd century after Josephus, because it has to be the fact that Luke is dependent on Josephus rather than the other way around. And so I always find this kind of stuff to be very interesting. Also, just a little point on that as well. Luke and Josephus, they contradict each other in those places as well, in a couple places where they are supposedly dependent upon one another. So that makes it not make any sense either. But
it almost seems like they were writing at the same time, or not aware of each other's works, huh?
Yeah, it seems like they just weren't aware of each other at all. But again, it's like they write about similar things and they mention some of the same names. And so people automatically assume, okay, well, that means Luke is in the 2nd century and he's writing and stealing from Josephus. And it's like, can we stop treating the Bible as if it's guilty until proven innocent? Why do we have to give it such a different standard than other historical documents? It's just really bizarre.
Well, and just to be clear, a lot of people don't know this, but normally when you're looking at historical documents, you assume that what you're looking at is reliable until it's shown to be other than reliable. It's not assumed to be guilty until proven innocent. It's assumed to be true until there comes other evidence that discredits it. So really, when we look at history, when historians are looking at documents and these sorts of things, they assume reliability until given good reason to think that it's not reliable, except when it comes to the Bible. I just want to really stress that point.
I agree.
But, you want to keep going?
Yeah, let's get back into it.
Clearly, Christianity has a monopoly on resurrection stories. It even has several of them, in fact. We've got Zarephath and Lazarus to just scratch the surface. As good old Christopher Hitchens put it,
the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived.
That said,
I wanted to make a quick comment on this. So first of all, he's failing to make the distinction between resuscitations and resurrections.
Right.
Jesus was resurrected, but Lazarus and the 27 or the people in Matthew 27 where their graves were opened up. So first of all, I have a video on this channel. I'll put a link in the description below where I actually think that people weren't raised from their graves and walking around. I think that that's
in
important.
Matthew. You do think that Jesus raised Lazarus, but you're talking specifically about the part in Matthew where Jesus dies, and then it says there were graves that were opened and a bunch of dead people were walking around. I just want to be very clear. That's what Nathan is talking about. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. So yes, in Matthew 27, after Jesus dies, and it says the graves busted open and there were people walking around. I actually think that's a literary device. So I don't necessarily think that is a historical attestation. However, even if it was, let's grant it for a moment, that would still be a resuscitation and not a resurrection. Same thing with Lazarus. He was raised from the dead, and I do believe that happened, but he was resuscitated. He wasn't resurrected. But Jesus was resurrected. And so I think that distinction is very, very important. And so
let's actually flesh out what you mean by that. So what is the difference between a resuscitation and a resurrection?
So a resuscitation is someone who is raised from the dead, but then they're going to die again. So it's like a temporary thing, but Jesus' resurrection, he's in a permanent body, right? So he's resurrected and he's in a glorified body that will live forever, according to Christian theology. So the difference between a resuscitation and a resurrection is that Lazarus, and if those people really were raised from their grave in Matthew 27, they would have also had to die again. So that's the major difference.
Okay. And I think that there's one other thing here that's very relevant to all of this, which is that none of these other people said that they were God.
Yeah.
Jesus was literally saying, I am God. That's why he was killed by the Pharisees, because they asked him, who are you? And he basically told them by quoting from the book of Daniel, he said, I am God, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that's why they tore their garments and they said, we don't need to hear anything else. This man is a complete and total heretic, because they thought he was a human being. And he's saying that he's God. And so Jesus said that he was God, and then he proved that he was God. And here's the thing. If Jesus had said that he was God, and he's making these very, very high claims of himself, which he was, and then he is brought back to life, that is a vindication of Jesus's claims, because God would not bring back a total heretic and vindicate everything that he had said. So I think that that's also incredibly relevant to all of this.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, let's continue.
All right.
It's fair to say that the resurrection of Jesus plays a unique role in the Christian faith. And considering just how many people are convinced of this supposed miraculous event, I think it merits attention. According to the channel Lines of Evidence, the resurrection of Jesus is a historical fact and proof that God exists. And we use their video to delve into some of the most common arguments the Christians put forth, with us this time focusing on what can be called the argument from eyewitness testimony.
Did Jesus Christ really come back from the dead? Yes, he did. In fact, it's the only logical conclusion to be drawn from the evidence.
Claiming that there is only one logical conclusion to be drawn, and that this conclusion is that a miracle happened, is a feature of religious dogma. But unfortunately, this isn't a rare position for Christians to take.
I wanted to make a quick comment about that. Actually, when you look at all of the evidence for the resurrection, I do think that once you start getting into atheist or agnostic, naturalistic explanations for the resurrection, they all tend to be really ad hoc, and they all tend to be basically just an assumption of naturalism. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, they're not rational, because they're begging the question for naturalism and saying, well, that couldn't be the case because miracles don't happen. So that they basically beg the question, which is not a rational position to hold for naturalism. And then they assume that all of the testimony for the resurrection has to be false based on that assumption of naturalism. And so I've yet to see a non-circular atheist hypothesis. Pelagia is probably the closest we have. I think his is the best attempt, but we actually debunked his resurrection theory recently, so people can go check that out on the channel as well. But other than that, it's usually just an assumption of naturalism, which is irrational, to beg the question.
Well, yeah, and there's a lot here because I don't know if he's saying that it's a religious thing to say we have the best explanation and we should go with the best explanation for all the facts, because atheists do that sort of thing all the time. I mean, if you ask them, well, why do you think evolution is true? They're going to give you a bunch of evidence and say all of this evidence points to evolution, which is the best explanation of the evidence. So are they religious, or are you only allowed to do that when you're not talking about miracles? I guess that's the thing. Because everybody in their right mind does that. We all make inferences to the best explanation when we're trying to account for something that we're observing as an explanation, right? So is it only theists that are being religious when we do that because we think that the best explanation is a miracle? And I mean, really all that says is he just thinks that religious people believe in miracles, which is like, yes, we do. And we have good reasons for it, but you don't think that they are good reasons because you don't believe in miracles. But that doesn't make us dogmatic. It just means you have a different worldview, a different way of seeing things. So I wanted to touch on that briefly.
Yeah, exactly. If we're not proving something deductively, then of course we're using abductive reasoning. And if we're doing that, then of course we're going off of probabilities and inferences to the best explanation. And for the resurrection evidence, I think by far the resurrection is the best explanation. And so I don't think there's any problem with coming to that conclusion, unless, of course, you want to beg the question for naturalism.
Yeah, and just to be clear with everybody, when you talk about abductive reasoning, a lot of people don't know what that is. Abductive reasoning is when you say, what is the best explanation for this given set of facts? And whereas inductive reasoning is basically where you reason from a bunch of particulars to a universal. So it's like, all I've seen is white swans, so therefore the next swan I see will likely be white. And then deductive reasoning is certain. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. But anyway, I think that he's basically just saying that religious people are fundamentalists because we believe in miracles, which is, I mean, it's kind of like a tautology because, of course, religious people believe in miracles. I don't know.
Yeah, and, we could basically say the same thing. It's like disbelieving in miracles is like a dogma of atheism. It's like, okay, you didn't really say anything.
Right, yeah. I mean, he's basically saying you're religious and therefore you're dumb. But let's keep going.
All right.
As we get into later, they pretty much need the resurrection to be undeniable for their broader theological claims to be even palatable.
To begin with, it was heavily documented through eyewitness testimony.
Well, if we're swimming in a sea of documentation, uncovering these first-hand narratives should be as straightforward as a stroll through the archives. It should be as easy to demonstrate as the confidence of the author suggests. So, enlighten us. How many of these eyewitness accounts do we have?
I'm going to say really quick, I want our audience to pay attention to what he's doing. He is specifically setting up the Gospels to not be good evidence by using the word firsthand. He's basically saying if Matthew doesn't say, hi, my name is Matthew, and I'm writing this Gospel, it's not eyewitness testimony. I want everyone to pay attention to him doing this because he just swapped. He did like a very clever rhetorical move where he's saying, if we have all this firsthand evidence, because apparently that's the only way it can be eyewitness testimony is if it's firsthand. If Matthew says, I am Matthew and I saw Jesus myself rise from the dead. If Matthew didn't write that way, then that means it's not eyewitness testimony. So I want everyone to pay very close attention to him doing this. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just want to say that the way that the Gospels are written, they're not written as if the gospel authors never specifically identify themselves is what I'm trying to say. Yep. And that doesn't mean that they aren't written by the names that they are attributed to. We have very good reason to believe that they are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And two of those are eyewitnesses. Mark was almost certainly writing down the testimony of Peter, and Peter was, of course, a very good eyewitness. And then Luke was going around writing down the eyewitnesses of pretty much everybody that he talked to that had knowledge of the events. So if I'm a police officer and I go to 5 different people who all saw an accident and I write down all their testimonies, and then I come up with a compilation of what all they said or a summary based on all the facts that they gave me. That's pretty much what Luke did. So these are direct eyewitness accounts, because Mark is using Peter, and Peter was a direct eyewitness. Luke is going to different direct eyewitnesses and writing down their accounts. And then John is a direct eyewitness, and Matthew was a direct eyewitness. So we have 4 sets of eyewitness accounts, direct eyewitness accounts.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note for people when they hear that, oh, well, Matthew never says, hi, my name is Matthew and I'm writing Matthew. How can that be an eyewitness account? How can we know that Matthew wrote Matthew? Well, there's a couple things to note. Number one, the Gospels are in a genre called ancient biography, and it was common within ancient biographies for the authors to not identify themselves. For example, we have many biographies by the author Plutarch, and he does not identify himself in any of them. And yet we know that Plutarch wrote them because of external attestation to Plutarch's authorship. People said Plutarch wrote this life. That's what they were called back then, lives. They weren't called biographies. That's like a more modern term. But we have external attestation. And so in the same way with the Gospels, we have external attestation to the 4 authors, and it's unanimous, it's universal, it's within a wide geographical spread, it's backed up by manuscript evidence. And so this is how we know who wrote the Gospels. And so it's not just like a religious dogma to say, oh, well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John said it because that's the titles in the Bible. No, we believe these people wrote these books because of the external attestation. In the same way I believe Plutarch wrote his biographies, in the same way I believe Plato wrote the Republic, because, by the way, he is not mentioned anywhere within the corpus of that book, et cetera, et cetera. Did you have anything else you wanted to say before we continue?
No, let's keep going.
All right. But yeah, everyone just continue to pay attention. He's really going to lay heavy on this idea of firsthand. He wants it to be like someone saying, I saw this myself. Well, watch what he's doing rhetorically here.
All Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record Jesus' interactions with numerous people following his resurrection.
4 accounts, huh? Wow, you're really building a strong case here. Though, I wouldn't bring it before a court, as personal testimony is considered one of the least reliable forms of evidence, prone to distortion and bias.
All right, I've got to talk about that really quick. The idea of testimony being really weak evidence. I really think it's important to understand the importance of human testimony for our knowledge. So this is a field of study called epistemology, which all that means is the study of knowledge. How do we know things? And there are 4 major pathways to knowledge, meaning there are 4 major ways that we come to know things in the world. Number 1 is perception. It's our senses. I see something, I hear something, taste, etc. There's our reasoning, our rational faculties. This is another way that we can come to logical truths or mathematical truths. We have our memory. You can remember something, and that can help you come to the knowledge of something that happened in the past. And then also we have human testimony. And a lot of people want to discount human testimony as, oh, that's just, something that is prone to bias. It's prone to change. People lie. And so this is unreliable. However, if you're going to reject human testimony, you're actually going to lead to some absurdities that you're not going to want to accept, because human testimony for rationality rules is the reason that he's even able to question the resurrection. Let me explain. So we are, Daniel and I, we're speaking English right now. The way that we learned English is through human testimony. Because when you really think about it, all we're doing is making random noises with our mouth that we've corresponded to a language. And so now these words have meaning. But if we really think about what we're doing, we're just making a bunch of noises. And so when you were a baby and you didn't know English, all you were hearing was a bunch of noises when your parents would speak. However, you trusted that when they would make certain noises out of their mouth, that it corresponded to some meaning, it corresponded to some object, it corresponded to you when they said the word Daniel, it corresponded to me when they said the word Nathan. And then over time, we learned the English language, and now we're able to talk in a language to talk about the resurrection. So the fact that rationality rules can even sit in front of a camera and question the resurrection is because of testimony. And so I really think it's problematic to sit here and question the validity of testimony and say, oh, that's just not going to be able to get us to knowledge about the past. A historical event, that's not going to be a reliable way for us to know if a miracle happened in the past. He's really, really causing a problem in his epistemology. And so I want to suggest that we take something called the anti-reductionist approach to testimony. And all that means is that we should trust testimony unless we have a good reason to doubt them. And so let me give 2 quick examples of what it would look like for testimony to be something we should doubt. Now, let's say we have one person testifying to something. We should doubt their testimony if what they say does not correspond to the facts at all. Let me give a thought experiment. Let's say that person A and person B were in a room together on Monday at 3 p.m. and then person A murdered person B. Okay, so he murdered person B on Monday at 3 p.m. Then let's say we have testimony from person C who says that he saw person A and person B walking together at the movie theater on the following Wednesday at 5 p.m. We would reject person C's testimony because we know that person B died on Monday at 3 p.m. So his testimony doesn't correspond to reality at all. Are the Gospels like this? I think we have good reason to doubt that. Now, the second kind of testimony that we would want to doubt, if we have multiple people testifying to something, is if they have complete unanimity in their story. So actually in the court of law, if you have 2 or 3 witnesses that give a testimony and they line up perfectly, there's no discrepancies in the way that they tell their story. In fact, that's a reason to doubt them, because that gives lawyers reason to think that the people got together beforehand and created a story so that they would all line up perfectly. And so actually what we have in the Gospels, when they have discrepancies in details, or what we might call prima facie tensions, like things that when you look at it on his face, it's like, that seems a little weird. It seems kind of hard to reconcile those 2 things together. That's actually a sign of honesty within human testimony. So once again, we don't have these kinds of defeating reasons for trusting the Gospels as testimony. And so since I take the anti-reductionist approach to testimony, that means that we should trust the testimony we have in the Gospels.
Well, I think that there's a few other things as well. Another thing that we would look for is someone with a reputation for lying, somebody that's untrustworthy. We would also call into account what they have to say. And when we look at the early Christians, do we have reason to doubt their character? And I would say absolutely not. These were people with such strong convictions about what they believed was true, men of such character that they were willing to literally die and be persecuted for their beliefs. That doesn't sound like a scoundrel to me. That sounds like someone who has nothing to gain and only cares about what is true and is willing to go to the ends of the world, ends of the earth for that belief. And so I think that that's very relevant. And the other thing that I want to say to this is this idea that testimony is bad. Essentially, that would, if we're going to take that to its logical conclusion, in addition to what you just said, we would need to just basically throw out everything we know from the past. Because pretty much before cameras came around or anything like that, everything that we have comes from testimony. I mean, how do we know what happened when Lincoln was assassinated? How do we know that John Wilkes Booth shot him? Testimony. That's how we know. Everybody in the theater saw John Wilkes Booth shoot Lincoln, and then he jumps down and he says, Sic semper tyrannis or something like that. And then he gets on his horse and he takes off. How do we know all that? Testimony. Are we just going to throw that out because testimony isn't a good source of information?
How do we know that Julius Caesar existed?
Right.
Testimony.
I mean, how do we know anything from like any time before the 1800s? Testimony. That's how we know anything about anything. It's literally all testimony. That's the only thing it can be. So if you're going to say, well, testimony is the least credible form of evidence, then I guess we just should throw away all of our books and everything that we think we know from the ancient world. But is that a reasonable thing to do? Is that what scholars do? No, it's not. So is he being reasonable right now? No, he's not. I mean, if the only type of evidence we can have from that time in order to verify a claim like this is testimony, and he's saying, well, testimony is incredible. Well, then even if this did happen, he would be wrong and he would dismiss it, even though we have really good evidence for it. He just doesn't like this particular type of evidence. But essentially what he's saying is you simply cannot prove it. It's tautological, because at this time, this is the only kind of evidence we can have. So anyway, I just wanted to foot stomp on that.
Yeah, and also another quick point, if we were to just ask the question, okay, so we have a man and the claim is he rose from the dead, and we were to revisit our 4 pathways to knowledge: perception, reason, memory, and testimony. How can we come to knowledge of this fact? Well, we can't use our perception. I can't see Jesus rising from the dead right now. I'm not looking at the empty tomb. I'm not currently living in 33 or 30 AD, depending on when you believe it happened. And so I can't see it for myself. My memory is not going to help me because, well, I wasn't alive back then either. I don't recall seeing that kind of thing. So what I'm going to have is human testimony to talk about it. And also, there's not going to be any archaeological evidence for me to look at with my perception either. So there's not going to be anything like that. All I can do is I can look at the human testimony, and then I can use my reasoning to come to the best explanation. And so when we really think about that, if he's going to set testimony to the side from the jump, what he's really doing is he's rejecting the resurrection before looking at any of the evidence, because he's set up this philosophical presupposition before even looking at the evidence. And he's kind of set up beforehand, I'm not going to accept this, because he's basically rejecting the only kind of pathway to knowledge on this topic that he could even have, which obviously is absurd.
Yeah, I do want to say one other thing briefly, which is that we do rely on testimony, not only from the past, but also in court cases. And there are times where many different people all see the same thing, and that is considered very strong evidence still. Does that mean that people are infallible? No, people have gotten things wrong, but that doesn't mean that we should conclude that therefore people are always wrong or that people are likely wrong. It depends on what they're seeing and how much agreement there is and how credible they are. All of these things need to be taken into account, and he's not taking them into account. He's just saying testimony bad. So anyway, let's continue.
Yeah, it's just not a nuanced perspective. So I hope everyone can see like why this is just a flawed methodology from the jump.
I mean, who needs more than a handful of stories about an event that defies everything we know about reality? It's not like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But hey.
I know that we want to talk about that as well. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I do. So I think that this idea of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is really the linchpin of his entire argument. And he only mentions it this one time, if I remember correctly. But essentially, the reason why I say this is the linchpin of his argument is because...
Well, I'll say, I think he refers to it one other time. He kind of like says, for this miracle, we have extraordinarily weak evidence. Like he kind of plays off of it later. But yeah, anyways, continue.
Well, the reason why I think that this is such a crucial part of his argument is because if we had this sort of evidence for any sort of other claim, no one would question it. If it wasn't a miracle claim, no one else would question it, period, end of story. It's only because this is a very serious claim that God sent his son to earth to die for our sins, and then he resurrected, and that this has huge implications on how we have to live our lives, that this is being called into question. Because just like with John Wilkes Booth and pretty much any other thing that we think we know from history, we really don't have anywhere near as much eyewitness testimony for anything else, especially from that time, as we do for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if you're going to take anything else from history and say, yeah, I think this is true, then what we are told about Jesus Christ should be thought to be true, that he rose from the dead. And I just want to say that this idea of extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence. It's really a rigged game in my view, because they never tell you how extraordinary they think the claim is. And they also never tell you how extraordinary the evidence is. And who gets to decide that? You know, when they say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, who decides what is extraordinary? They do. They get to decide how extraordinary the claim is, and they get to decide how extraordinary the evidence is. So, of course, they're going to say that a claim that they don't like is really, really super duper extraordinary, and they get to decide that. And then they also get to decide how good your evidence is. Well, is your evidence super duper extraordinary? Well, guess what? No, it's not. So I guess it doesn't meet my bar. And so therefore I can just throw it out. And it's a completely rigged game. The question we should be asking is, does the evidence that we have, what is the best explanation for it? What is the best explanation for the evidence that we have? And the best explanation in this case is the resurrection, believe it or not. The most parsimonious explanation for all the evidence that we have, if you don't come into it biased and thinking that miracles just cannot happen, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and it's not even close. You can even ask ChatGPT, what is the best explanation for the evidence of the resurrection? And it will tell you that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead. And it's obvious.
I think that's true, but also what you're getting at is really important. I want to put it in these terms. The problem with this claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is that it's completely arbitrary and it's completely subjective. And it's exactly what you were saying. They get to say what extraordinary is, and they just get to sit back on their hands they get to sit back with their arms crossed and say like, all right, convince me, bro. And if you don't, and by the way, anything you provide is not going to be extraordinary by my standards. And so it's pretty insane. I also have a quote from Thomas Sherlock here that I wanted to read really quickly. He says, because I want to say, I do think it's fair that if someone's making a extraordinary claim that you would want a little bit more evidence than for a normal thing. Like if I told you that when I woke up this morning or this afternoon, because I work night shift, so I wake up in the afternoon. So if I told you, Daniel, when I woke up this afternoon, I had a cup of coffee, you wouldn't need a lot of evidence for that. You'd be like, yeah, that sounds like a pretty normal thing. But if I told you yesterday, like I hit 14 home runs in a baseball game yesterday, you'd probably ask me like, hey, well, do you have a video of it? Like, that sounds really crazy. You probably wouldn't just believe me immediately. And so here's a quote from Thomas Sherlock that can hopefully get us thinking a little bit about this. He says, I do allow that this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases. But it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question are quite manifestly objects of sense. Here's what he means by this, because if you remember, Rationality Rules has kind of set up the standard where he's not going to accept testimony because testimony bad. And so he's not allowing for any evidence. But what Thomas Sherlock is pointing out here is that the things about the resurrection are objects of our senses, right? So the apostles were able to see. And Daniel, let me ask you a question. This should be it's going to be a trick question. It's going to be really hard for you to answer. I hope you have it. I hope you have at least 300 IQ because that's what it's going to take. Can you tell that I am currently alive right now?
Yes, I think I can.
Okay. Whew. You passed. Okay. If I were to be killed, do you think you'd be able to tell if I were dead?
Yes, especially if I were in the same room as you, because your body would be cold.
Okay. There you go. you all you have right there is the expertise that we need in order to know if someone has risen from the dead, because you can tell when I'm alive and you can tell when I'm dead. And then, hey, if you saw me walking around again, you'd be able to tell that I'm alive again. And so I think the important thing about this is this isn't rocket science. You don't need some sort of specialized knowledge. You don't need to be, you don't need a PhD to know if someone rose from the dead. And so, and by the way, a lot of people want to say, oh, people in the ancient world, they were super gullible. They would believe anything. And so we write them off because even though it's an object of sense and it's something that could have been seen, and it's not something that, it's something that would be hard to be wrong about, if we're being honest, based on what you just demonstrated, that you can tell that I'm alive. You could tell that if I had died, and you would be able to see if I'm alive again. But here's the truth. People in the ancient world knew when something extraordinary was happening. Let's even look in the Gospels. When Mary was impregnated by the Holy Spirit, Joseph was like, hey, like people are going to think you were sleeping around without me, and that's not going to look good for our reputation. Should I divorce her?
Thought that she had.
Yeah. And then also Thomas, whenever Jesus had rose from the dead and the apostles told him, what did he say? He's like, I'm not going to believe until I see his scars in his hand and his side. So the apostles knew that the resurrection and the virgin birth and all these things were miraculous claims. They understood this. And so for people to just write this off like, oh, the people in the ancient world wouldn't have known this was a miracle, that's ridiculous. Of course they knew it was a miracle. That's why they're talking about it. That's why they are believing Jesus is the Messiah. It's because he rose from the dead. And they're like, this vindicates his ministry. This vindicates all the things that he said.
Made them so bold.
Yeah. And again, it's an object of sense. It's very easy to tell when someone's alive and when someone is dead. And so they don't need to be educated, like scholars of their day to know that Jesus rose from the dead. It's very easy thing to see. So you have anything else you want to say, or you want to keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going.
All right.
I'm sure these 4 accounts are completely independent, unbiased, and totally reliable. It's not like they could have been influenced by each other or anything, right?
Sometimes foreshadowing
Right.
is relatively obvious.
Now,
Sorry, I just wanted his little meme to play. He's going to, once again, he's doing some rhetorically clever things here. Once again, he's saying they're dependent upon one another and they're biased. So, Daniel, I want you to talk really quickly about how he's going to heavily lean on bias. He's going to keep saying these are biased sources. These are biased, like these guys are Christians. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about this and why this is insane.
Yeah, sure. To me, it's really strange if you just think about it for a second, because imagine if all of the eyewitnesses that we had that saw Lincoln get shot, if we were like, well, they're all just biased because they just don't like John Wilkes Booth at all. So that's why they're saying that John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln. It's like, no. They are not biased against John Wilkes Booth going in. They're biased against John Wilkes Booth because he shot Lincoln. And that's why they're saying he shot Lincoln. And it's not reasonable to say, well, are there people who didn't see John Wilkes Booth shoot Lincoln who attested to John Wilkes Booth shooting Lincoln? What would that even mean? No, we have a bunch of people who actually witnessed the event, and all of them are saying John Wilkes shot Lincoln, and then he jumped down from the upper deck, and then he ran away. All these people saw it. He did it in front of a bunch of people, right? And in the same way, everything that we have from the people who actually witnessed it, all of the records that we still have are from them saying this happened. So it's not that they're biased going in, it's that they're biased because of what they saw. And I don't even think it's right to say that it's biased. It's just that if you see something and it's obvious to you that it is true, then you believe it. I mean, I believe that 9/11 happened, right? Does that mean that I'm biased towards the fact of 9/11, that the Twin Towers crashed down? I don't even know what that means. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. A bunch of other people saw it. There are people that were impacted by it, people that died from it, families impacted. I think that we have tons of evidence for it. So I just believe that it happened. And in the same way, everyone that wrote the Gospels and the Creed and everyone that saw Jesus, they saw him and they wanted everyone to know because it was really, really important. So,
yeah. And I have 2 things I want to say. So first, on the biased piece, I think it's really interesting that he's wanting people who aren't Christian to attest to the resurrection. It's like if they believed in the resurrection, they would be Christians. If Suetonius or Tacitus believed in the resurrection, they would not be secular sources. You would be calling rationality rules, you'd be calling them biased. You would be saying, oh, well, they're just Christian biased sources and all this stuff. It's ridiculous. So the fact that he's wanting, secular attestation, that would be unbiased attestation to the resurrection is ridiculous. And then secondly, he's really going to rely heavily on the fact that the Gospels are partially dependent upon one another because, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source heavily, but this is actually going to bite him because he is going to want to say that the Gospels are anonymous and that the Gospels, we don't know who wrote them and they're contradictory and all this stuff. But the problem with that is if we don't know who wrote the Gospels and the earliest Christians didn't know who wrote the Gospels, then why did Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source? It doesn't make any sense. So actually, the fact that Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source, it only makes sense, especially given the genre of the Gospels are ancient biographies, which are specifically to try to tell about the life of a human being who lived. Why would they use Mark as a source unless Mark was a reliable source? And that only makes sense on traditional authorship. Both the name of Mark, because Mark wasn't himself a disciple, but also the fact that based on testimony, Mark is based on the testimony of Peter. And so Matthew and Luke using Mark as a source actually points to our case. Like it actually is evidence in our favor. It doesn't do anything for his case. Him saying that Matthew and Luke are using Mark as a source, it doesn't help his case at all. It actually helps us because it shows that Matthew and Luke viewed Mark very highly and said like, hey, if I'm going to write a biography about this guy named Jesus, I need to use this source here.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that he's doing a lot of things rhetorically, and he's saying a lot without saying very much at all. He's really
Yeah.
trying to make claims without having to actually make a case for the claims. He's trying to hint at things and undermine things without actually having to appeal or really make a case. He's just kind of being snide and talking around things. And I think, honestly, the reason why he does that is because he's very, very ignorant of the evidence, which is going to be more apparent pretty soon here, I think. He really reveals his hand, I would say. But you want to get back into it?
I did just want to say as well, this is the problem with rhetoric, because he's doing a lot of sneaky tactics rhetorically. He's very good rhetorically. And notice how we're only about 3 minutes into his video, and we've been talking for almost 40 minutes or a little over 40 minutes, debunking his 3 minutes of talking points. This is the issue with like social media right now, is like you have these little sound bites and these things that people say like, oh, well, this is, they'll say like a one sentence, like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And it's like, it takes us 5 to 10 minutes to break that down and why that doesn't make any sense. But he can say it in one sentence. And so whenever people are watching these kinds of things, you need to be careful not to be taken away by the rhetoric, but to really dive into the philosophy underlying it. So I'll continue now.
These accounts, scholarly consensus, including from Christian scholars, tell us that these texts were written decades after the events they describe by followers who believe deeply in Jesus' divinity. This context doesn't automatically discredit their accounts, of course, but it does invite us to question how memory, belief, and community might shape storytelling. It encourages, at the very least, a healthy dose of skepticism.
Paul,
I wanted to say really quick to that. Notice what he's saying. He's saying, because our testimony is from Christians, we should doubt it. We should be skeptical. And again, the same thing with what Daniel was saying earlier. It's like with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Should we doubt the testimony of the people that said it happened because they believed it happened? Should we doubt Plutarch's testimony about what happened in his biographies because he believed it happened? It just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a lot to this. First of all, he says decades. He doesn't say exactly how many decades, but when he says it that way, it makes it sound like there's a bunch of decades. And even by most liberal scholars, the latest decade gospel is written would be the Gospel of John, and they date that to 90 AD, which would be 60 years after the life of Christ. I think all of the Gospels were written before 70 AD. You might disagree with me on that, Nathan, but I think they were all out before 70 AD, which would be no more than 40 years, I think. And I think that the reason for that is because none of them mention the temple's destruction. But that means that, wherever you date it, at most, the worst case scenario is 60 years, but probably a lot sooner than that. And it really doesn't matter to me all that much because, number one, these men were likely, they likely had very good memories because this was an oral culture. They learned how to remember things. They would recite scripture. I mean, they would memorize huge portions of the Torah typically. So this was an oral culture. They were very good at retaining things as they happened, and they cared a lot about accuracy. And the second thing that's really crucial here is that either Jesus returned from the grave or he didn't. If he did, then I think that proves that Christianity is true. And that's not something that is going to be forgotten after a few decades. It's just simply not. So did all the Gospels say that he rose from the grave? Yes. I mean, maybe Mark didn't. Would you say that Mark says that Jesus rose from the grave?
Yeah. So what he's referring to is that, the earliest version of Mark doesn't have post-resurrection appearances. But the earliest version of Mark does have the resurrection. It has the empty tomb. Yeah. It has the empty tomb, and then the angel tells the women, by the way, Jesus rose, go meet him in Galilee. So it definitely has the resurrection. It just doesn't have the post-resurrection appearances. Yeah,
that's right. I couldn't remember. I knew it didn't have one of those things. I wasn't sure which one it was, but all of the Gospels then have the resurrection in it. And so all the eyewitness testimonies that we have are agreed that Jesus came back from the dead. And that is the most important part of Christianity. And that is not something that these men were likely to just embellish on, because this is a huge claim. So I really don't think that what he's saying is relevant at all, frankly. It's either true that he rose from the dead and Christianity is true, or it's not true. And 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years is not going to make someone falsely think, oh, you know what? He actually rose from the dead. That's just not enough time. And not only that, but we have a creed, which I think we're going to talk about in a bit, which shows that the Christians were saying he rose from the dead between 3 months and 3 years, maybe 5 years after he had risen. So this is totally relevant. You want to keep going?
Yeah, I just had one thing I wanted to say as far as the quote unquote decades. So the first thing I'll say is I think all of the synoptic gospels are pre-70. I would put Matthew, Mark, Luke before 70. I can see the arguments for why they placed John in the 90s, because John refers to the Jews as the Jews rather than like the scribes, the Pharisees. He refers to them as the Jews, which kind of leads people to think that it was after the Council of Jamnia in 90 AD. So that's kind of why people place it there. It's because of the way John refers to the Jews, which I could see that because the other gospels don't refer to them as the Jews. And that was something that kind of happened at that point where the Jews and the Christians were like two distinct groups and everyone kind of viewed them that way. So I could see John being later, but either way, the synoptics are earlier. And let's even give the skeptics their dates, 40 years. Okay. What's something that happened 40 years ago? That's the 80s. Would you say that your parents aren't able to remember something that happened in the 80s? Like, I just don't understand.
I mean, imagine if JFK had been shot and there was no recording of it, right? But it was all over the news and everybody knew at the time that JFK had been shot. And then 40 years later, your parents are telling you, 40 years ago, JFK got assassinated. I remember where I was. And you're like, 40 years, I don't know. That's a long time. Are you sure he got assassinated? It's like, I'm sure. Like, you're an idiot.
Yeah, dude, it's crazy how skeptical, like, people turn their skeptical lenses so high for the gospels. It's like, kind of like you said earlier, if we had this same evidence for any other event, no one would question it at all. It's literally just because it's like Christianity that people question it this much. It's actually kind of insane.
Yeah, it is. I mean, 40 years is not that long ago.
It's like, of course people can remember something from the 80s, like, because we're recording this in 2025 in case people are watching this way in the future. Like, 40 years ago is not like, do you really think your parents can't remember the 80s? I could go ask my parents right now what happened in the 80s and they could tell me a ton of stuff. That wasn't a resurrection.
Especially big events. And there would be no bigger event in someone's life than Jesus returning from the grave and them seeing him again. I mean, give me a break.
Yes, especially when we consider that Christians were, proclaiming the resurrection, as you said, from months. We have this creed that dates months to years. And the book of Acts tells us that within 40 days of the resurrection, they were proclaiming it to the Jews and the Romans. And so basically the Christians were going and proclaiming this message throughout the entirety of the 40-year period, so to speak. So think of it this way. Eusebius, he records a quote from Papias talking about how Peter taught in Jesus's Kriya, his teachings. He was repeating Jesus's teachings and going around and preaching them. So not only did Jesus repeat his teachings hundreds of times, like when he would go from city to city to city, he would repeat the same parables over and over and over again. So the disciples heard the same parables multiple times, making it much easier to remember. Then they're going around and repeating the exact same teachings over and over and over and over again, and they're proclaiming the resurrection over and over and over again. That's going to even solidify their memory even more. Repetition makes something way more memorable. And so I just think it's absurd to say like, oh, well, it happened decades later, so therefore their memory is not reliable. It's like, what?
I know. I mean, I can remember pretty much everything that happens in all 3 Lord of the Rings movies. And that's because I've seen those things like 50 times. But also because they're really valuable to me. I love those movies. They're some of my favorite movies. But, they're also, if you have something like that in your life, that's not a movie or whatever, and it happens over and over and over again, of course you're going to remember it. And you're going to have that like right there in your head. And especially if other people saw it too. So anyway, let's keep going.
All right.
Adds that Jesus made an appearance to over 500 people at one time.
Oh, Paul, you mean the guy that didn't meet Jesus and didn't meet an apostle until years after the alleged event? That Paul.
All right, so really quick on this. So yes, Paul did not meet Jesus personally during his ministry. I think that's a fair point to say.
Not really.
Okay, what would you say?
There's a little thing called the road to Damascus where Paul actually did meet Jesus. That's literally why Paul became the 12th apostle. So,
Well, I meant like during
I
his
know what you
ministry.
mean, like,
Sorry,
he should be saying that because Paul literally said, "I did meet Jesus."
Okay. Yeah, that's true. Okay. So let me take that back then. But I do think it's fair to say that Paul was not a disciple. He wasn't a follower of Jesus during his ministry. However, Paul did claim to meet Jesus after his resurrection, and he saw the resurrected Jesus, and it changed his life forever. That was what he claimed. And so he's basically saying Paul is lying at this point, right?
Yeah, I would say so. That Paul is a liar. Yeah, which is very uncharitable, but I don't know what more we can expect. You want to keep going?
Yeah.
Well, if he says it happened, it must be true. I mean, sure, it's not 500 eyewitnesses, but rather just one guy claiming that there are 500 witnesses. But who needs corroboration when you've got Paul's word? It's not like he had a reason to embellish.
Can we pause it there?
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So this is really important. He's acting like when Paul says that there were 500 eyewitnesses, that Paul is just telling us that there were 500 witnesses, but he doesn't understand that this is a creed that Paul is relaying to us. Okay. So just to be very clear, the Christians got together within a very short time from Jesus's resurrection. Okay. Like Jesus dies, he resurrects. And then very soon after that, within a few months to at most a few years, they all got together and talked with one another and agreed upon a creed. Okay, and this creed is what Paul is relaying to us in 1 Corinthians. So this isn't Paul saying, oh yeah, 500 people. No, Paul is telling us of a creed that the early Christians developed themselves based on what they saw. And these early Christians said Jesus Christ rose from the grave. They said that 500 people saw him. They said that he was seen by the 12 disciples who are now the apostles, and that he was seen by James, the brother of Jesus. And James, who was a skeptic, ended up becoming one of the leaders of the church. What he saw changed his entire life, and he ended up being martyred for his faith. He got thrown off a building and beaten to death. Okay, so this is what Rationality Rules is talking about, and he doesn't know what he's talking about, because this isn't just Paul trying to tell us, oh yeah, 500 people saw Jesus, I guess. No, Paul is telling us of a creed that was developed by the Christians who were in a place to know if it was true. And so Paul is just relaying that creed. I want to be very clear about that. So I hope everyone understands what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that's very, very good stuff. And he's making a second point right before I paused it. He's saying, like, it's not like Paul had reason to embellish this or something. And I want to be very, very clear. Most people, when they're pushing movements like this, they have three main motivations: power, sex, and money. And Paul literally did not sleep with anyone, according to his own testimony throughout his ministry. He did not do this for money. In fact, he was a tent maker, and he was basically running off of donations from people as he was traveling. And
it's worse than that.
Huh?
It's worse than that too, because he was actually a Pharisee. So he was setting himself up to be a very important person. He was already wealthy. And then the opposite happened to him once he became a Christian. He became persecuted. He lost his wealth. He became a tent maker. So he was on the road to have a very successful career. And then he forsook all of that because he met Jesus Christ. So it's literally the opposite. It's not that he embraced some kind of cult in order to have all these wealth status things like women and power and these sorts of things. He actually lost all of it because of Christianity. So it's worse than even that.
Yeah, and he was aware of the persecution of Christians because he was one of the ones doing it. So it's like he knew that the Christians were like the way the Christians were being treated because he was one of the ones doing it. So I totally agree with you. I just wanted to point out that these three motivations are typically what cult leaders start cults for or join cults for. Is for these three main motivations. And Paul very obviously was not motivated by any of them. So for him to say, oh, it's not like Paul had any reason to embellish these things, it's like, come on, dude.
Sure, he was totally objective and unbiased. But hey, maybe I'm being too harsh. After all, if 500 people saw it, there must be a ton of written accounts from them, right? Right?
Paul wrote to the Corinthians that most of those eyewitnesses were still alive at the time of his writing.
No way. most of those supposed 500 eyewitnesses were still kicking around 20 to 25 years later when Paul wrote about it. That's a miracle in its own right. Seriously, what are the odds that out of 500 people, not a single one of them could write or knew someone literate who could document this allegedly life-changing event over the course of 2 decades? Not one account. The only thing we have here is Paul, who wasn't there, simply claiming secondhand that they saw the resurrected Jesus. This is what we call hearsay.
Hearsay?
Okay, I saw you unmuted your mic. Did you have something you want to say?
Yeah, there's a lot to say. So this idea that these 500 people, that we would have their accounts, I think is pretty ridiculous, because their accounts are in the creed. You know, the early Christians who saw Jesus Christ, they got together and they came up with the creed. And I'm sure that a lot of those 500 people were Christians, probably all of them, right? Because they saw the risen Christ. So that is their account. They agreed on the creed. And unless you want to say that the 12 disciples just made up this 500 number, which is like, why would they make that up? Then that's their account. And not only that, but maybe some of them did write it down. We're talking about 2,000 years here. We're literally talking about a 2,000-year period. So would we expect that we would have their witness statements? And these people weren't like leaders of the church. So why would their witness statements be copied and copied and copied so that we would have it to this day? That's just not reasonable. What's much more reasonable is that the leaders of the church would have their written accounts copied and preserved. And that's what we have. We have the leaders of the church. We've got, Peter's account, which is told by Mark, and we've got Matthew and John and Luke. And Luke did go probably and talk to a lot of those 500 eyewitnesses and got their testimonies. I mean, that's what he was collecting, was testimonies, right? So, but that's what we see is we see the leaders of the church, their gospels and letters are preserved and have been passed down. So this idea that we should have all these like witness testimonies from these 500 is just ridiculous. Like, they all knew what happened and they weren't thinking, oh, let me write this down and try and preserve it so that Rationality rules will believe that Jesus rose from the dead, in 2,000 years. Like, we don't think about that. We don't even think about doing stuff like that today, when something.
And even if we had it, he would reject it because testimony bad.
That's true. Even if he had all 500 still preserved, he would say, well, testimony isn't reliable. So it's that's totally valid too.
By his own standard. Also, I want to, just for anyone that doesn't have any knowledge of manuscripts and the way that they're preserved, it's really actually unlikely that we would have even if, let's say, all 500 of them wrote down a statement, it's very unlikely that we would have any of them. And here's why: because they would have been in the Jerusalem, Israel area. And basically we have almost no manuscripts from that area. Most of our manuscripts are found in Egypt and Oxyrhynchus. And the reason for this is, for a manuscript to be preserved for like 2,000 years, basically the climate either has to be dry all the time or wet all the time, because the manuscripts have to be in very consistent environments in order for a manuscript to be preserved. And so basically where manuscripts are preserved is in Egypt. So unless one of these testimonies of this person that wasn't a leader of the church was copied and then sent to Egypt for some reason, we would not expect at all to see any of these things. And so, and also for Rationality Rules to say something like this, it just shows that he doesn't really understand the way that writings are preserved and how much we've lost to time. We have writings from mostly like major historical figures that wrote a ton and were considered very authoritative because their writings are preserved and copied over centuries. And that's why we have their writings. Yeah. And so for him to think that like these random people that weren't leaders in the church would have their writings preserved over hundreds of years and having their writings passed around to multiple countries and things like this, it just shows he's pretty ignorant of how manuscripts are preserved.
Yeah, he's being very, very naive. I mean, think about how important Aristotle was, and we lost all of his writings until I think like the 1200s, and then it turned up that we had some, but we don't even have all of Aristotle's writings, if I remember correctly, and we didn't have any of them for hundreds of years. We thought that all of it had been lost. We knew about him, but we didn't know anything that he had written, and then we found some of his writings. I mean, like think about how much was lost in the Library of Alexandria and everything. So.
Yeah.
I mean,
there's actually a historian, I forget their name. I wish I could remember it off the top of my head, but they said that essentially based on quotes that we have and references to ancient authors, we can basically conclude that we've lost like 95+% of all writings in the ancient world based on like people that are referenced and then writings that we actually have. So the writings we have is just so scarce. It's ridiculous for him to think that we would have it's
actually really sad when you think about it. I mean, imagine how much we've actually lost. But anyway, let's keep going.
But then think about how miraculous it is of all the stuff we do have. It's like the testimony we do have corroborates Jesus's ministry so well. And we'll get into that probably a little bit later.
Yep.
It's almost as if, and bear with me here, this claim is less reliable than the countless alien abductions we hear about. But no, that can't be right. Paul said it, so it must be true. That's the rule here, no? Never mind that he wasn't.
Yeah, so a few things here. He's doing the rhetoric thing again, which is where you don't really make an argument. You just kind of say things in a certain way where it's persuasive. So what did he do? He conflated alien sightings, right, with the 500 people who saw Jesus Christ. So now you're thinking, okay, well, if people saw aliens, well, that's silly, so therefore these people said that they saw the risen Christ. So I guess that's silly too. And frankly, I think when you look at the eyewitness testimony of some of these alien encounters, I do think that some of them are very, very interesting. I mean, there are times where you've got two people who have nothing of interest, if I remember right. Like they aren't interested in any kind of aliens at all. They're like normal dudes, and then all of a sudden they both get taken, and then they have like this really weird experience. So I think that there's something going on with some of those stories, with those testimonies. Obviously, not all of them, but I don't think that even if we throw all of that out, like all of those alien encounter testimonies or whatever. I mean, what's the conclusion? Like some people lie about alien encounters, so therefore we just can't trust testimony, I guess. I don't know. But and then he said something else as well. Could you play the last bit there?
Yeah, basically like Paul said it, so it has to be true.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And they said, well, Paul said it, so it has to be true. And he doesn't even understand that this isn't Paul actually saying it. He's relaying a creed that the early Christians gave to him. And so he doesn't even understand what he's talking about. This isn't Paul saying it.
And to go back to what I said earlier with testimony, we should take the anti-reductionist approach. Without good, solid defeaters or doubting or reasons to doubt Paul's testimony, we should trust it. And Paul was persecuted for his belief. He went from persecuting Christians to being persecuted as a Christian because he said that he met the risen Jesus. And he was not pursuing power, sex, or money. And he was ultimately killed for his faith. And so unless Rationality Rules wants to provide some kind of reason for me to doubt Paul, I'm going to trust him.
I mean, seriously, is there, I just want to say real quick, is there a more credible type of eyewitness than Paul? I mean, like in this, if you look at Muhammad, for example, I mean, he literally did pursue power. He had a bunch of wives, and he conquered a bunch of different territories and all of that stuff. Same with Joseph Smith, by the way. I'm probably going to get in trouble with Islam, with Muslims and Mormons, but Joseph Smith did the same thing, had a bunch of wives, and had a lot of power. None of the apostles did that sort of thing. None of them. They all suffered and were persecuted, and almost all of them, except John, were martyred for their faith. They had nothing to gain, everything to lose, and they put it all on the line, and they lost it, and they didn't care. What made them so bold? And if these aren't the kinds of eyewitnesses that you can trust, what are?
Yeah, 100%.
The rule here, no. Never mind that he wasn't even there and had every reason to promote this new religion. Just ignore that. I'm starting to think that the creator of this video might be onto something here. Who needs first-hand accounts and contemporary evidence when you've got second-hand stories from biased sources? That's how history works, right? I can't.
Actually, a lot of history does come from secondhand accounts, and ancient history is, again, it's very scant. We don't have a lot of it. A lot of it is hearsay.
I mean,
but
that's the crazy thing. I mean, that's the crazy thing. Everything we know about Alexander the Great comes from secondhand sources. I mean, the earliest historian that wrote about Alexander the Great, I believe, wrote about him 400 years after. That's correct, isn't it? 400 years after his death. And we still consider that to be credible, and we think that we know quite a bit about his life. And that came to us 400 years after his death, whereas the accounts of Jesus Christ are written by literal eyewitnesses, direct eyewitnesses, and they come to us just a few decades after his death. And we have an early creed saying that he rose from the dead that is within months to a few years after his death. There is nothing that even comes close to what we have as far as historical evidence for the resurrection when it comes to any other claim of history. Like Christianity is more well attested than anything else we have from anywhere near that time. And it's not even close.
It's not close. And that's what I was saying earlier. It's like, it's amazing how much we've lost, but the things that we do have corroborate our testimony so well. It's amazing. Like when Josephus mentions that James had a brother named Jesus, and when Suetonius and Tacitus mention like the persecution of the Christians and things like this, and in the book of Acts, that's exactly what we see. They're being persecuted, and in Paul's letters, he's being persecuted and imprisoned. And it's like all the secular sources corroborate that for us and say, yeah, they were being persecuted and they were being treated badly. And so it's like, with what we have preserved, it corroborates our testimony in the gospel so well. It's amazing. So let's keep going.
Can't wait to see what other incredible stories they've got in store for us. Bring on the talking donkeys and the parting of the seas.
The implication is clear. If you doubt the resurrection, there are a host of people you can go ask who saw him with their own two eyes.
Hold up, let me get this straight. You're telling me that if I doubt the resurrection, I can just ask a bunch of people who saw it with their own eyes. Now, that is incredible. I mean, it's not like those people have been dead for nearly 2,000 years or anything. Are they gonna...
Rationality rules completely misunderstood his point.
Yeah.
The point was, Paul was saying basically, if you were alive at the time he wrote 1 Corinthians, which was in the 50s, he wrote it around 52, 53 AD, most scholars think. So Paul is basically saying in the 50s, you could basically go ask these people that saw Jesus. He was basically saying, by the way, they're still alive, go ask them. And so Rationality Rules is just completely misunderstanding what the video he's responding to is saying.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, the guy thinks that he's an intellectual and he's completely whiffing on just basic point, which is that Paul is saying you can go and talk to these people, not that people 2,000 years later can go and talk to these people.
Yeah. And this was to me like the weirdest comment in the video. I was like, what is he talking about? So anyways,
that's his worst moment of the whole thing, frankly.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Gonna resurrect for story time or something. But hey, let's ignore the glaring problem with this argument for a moment.
No, your argument's the one that has a problem.
If we could actually interrogate these supposed eyewitnesses, I'm sure their accounts would be rock solid and completely consistent. Right?
I mean, but can we talk about how stupid this is? Is he really saying that Paul is saying that we right now can talk to these eyewitnesses that saw Jesus? Like these eyewitnesses are supposed to still be here, and we can go and just like, hey, you were an eyewitness, right? You lived 2,000 years ago, or you're still here. Let me go talk to you and figure out tell me about Jesus, right? Like you saw Jesus. I mean, this is just really bad. Like this is bad.
I was really confused by this part of the video. I was sitting there like, what is he saying? Like I sent this video to a couple of my friends to ask about this part. I was like, is he really like saying this? And they were like, what is he talking about? So, I mean, yeah, unless I'm understanding him, it just seems like he's completely missing the point here.
Because they don't exist. Despite the confidence of Christians, as we're seeing here, this crucial, miraculous claim is unsupported. When it comes to the resurrection, an extraordinarily miraculous claim, we have extraordinarily poor evidence. What we have is a handful of contradictory, second-hand accounts written decades after the supposed event by anonymous authors with a clear agenda to promote an early Christian movement. We don't have.
If they were anonymous, how does he know they're biased?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, he's just assuming that they must be biased because obviously they're lying, because obviously miracles don't happen. So if miracles don't happen, then either they're lying or they are deceived. But since they all seem to be saying that Jesus rose from the dead, they must be lying or biased, I guess is the logic here. But I just want to reiterate, he's saying that we don't have good evidence. And when it comes to this period of time, we have better evidence for this theory that Jesus rose from the dead than we have for any other claim anywhere close to this time. I mean, and it's not even close. So if you're going to say that this isn't good evidence, then we don't have good evidence to believe anything from history, basically, especially from antiquity.
Yeah, I was going to say
throughout everything we know from antiquity.
Yeah, I was going to say for the ancient world, the resurrection is not even close to how much evidence we have for it. Also, basically everything he said in that sentence was false. It's rhetorically powerful. Again, he's playing with rhetoric, but almost everything he said was false. They're not secondhand accounts. We have Matthew and John, which are eyewitness accounts. Mark and Luke they could be secondhand because they're based on eyewitness accounts, but either way, they're still based on eyewitness testimony.
It's still not really secondhand, because if a police officer writes down my testimony, that's still a firsthand account.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So, okay, there we go. We have eyewitness accounts, and he's saying that they were written decades and decades. He's wanting it to sound like 70, 80, 90. Even if they're written in the 70s, we already talked about why we can still trust that. If you can remember, if your parents could tell you something that happened in the 80s that was a crazy, cool event, then we can trust the Gospels, even if they were written in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He said that they're contradictory. I would love for him to produce a quote unquote contradiction that actually violates the law of non-contradiction. We do have discrepancies in details, but again, that's expected in eyewitness testimony. And if the accounts were completely cohesive and there were no discrepancies, we would actually have more reason to doubt them, because that would be one of the defeating reasons. We would believe like, okay, these guys got together, came up with a lie, and then they're all telling it exactly perfect. And so the fact that we have discrepancies within the documents themselves gives us reasons to trust them, not the other way around. In fact, if they agreed on every detail, he would doubt them even more. He'd be like, look, they were completely coming together and making this up. So it's like a heads I win, tails you lose kind of deal.
Yep. Let's keep going.
Yep.
Have any contemporary historical records, physical evidence, or neutral eyewitness testimony that would be expected for such a monumental occurrence.
Notice what he just said. Let me back that up. I want to hear that one more time.
Eyewitness test. Any contemporary historical records, physical evidence.
Okay, he just said we don't have any contemporary historical records. Literally, the Gospels are ancient biographies. Then he said we don't have physical evidence. What physical evidence would you want for a man rising from the dead? Does he want Jesus's body like in front of him? I don't even know what he means by that. And then what did he say after that?
It's just rhetoric.
Neutral eyewitness.
Or neutral eyewitness testimony. So he's saying we have to have a completely unbiased source, which doesn't even exist, by the way. Everyone's biased. So he's basically saying
he wants somebody who saw Jesus live after his death who remained neutral to the fact. Like, yeah, I saw him, but he didn't rise from the dead because I'm neutral. I don't know. Like, it's really dumb. Yeah, like, obviously, if a neutral source says, "Yeah, I saw him rise from the dead," well, now he's biased. So
yeah, now he's a Christian and he's just biased. So notice, for everyone listening, notice how he's just piecing together a bunch of rhetorically strong statements that aren't true or are ridiculous.
As testimony that would be expected for such a monumental occurrence. Not a single record. The earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't even include any post-resurrection appearances by Jesus.
But it does include the resurrection, as we already talked about. There's the empty tomb, and then the angels tell the women, go find Jesus, go get Peter and the apostles, and he will meet you in Galilee. So Mark presupposes that the resurrection happened.
Jesus. None. Let that sink in. And the other Gospels that do mention appearances present conflicting details about who saw Jesus, where, and when.
And that gives us reason to trust them because, again, they don't violate the law of non-contradiction. There are no genuine full-on contradictions that can't be reconciled. For example, John chapter 20 says that Mary Magdalene saw Jesus resurrected. There is no gospel that says Mary Magdalene at no point at any time saw the resurrected Jesus. That would be a contradiction. Nothing like that exists in the Gospels. And so if he's not going to substantiate that claim, it can simply be ignored.
They read precisely like legendary embellishments rather than sober historical reporting.
Actually, no, they don't. Yeah, if we let's read the Gospel of Peter at the resurrection, which was written in the 2nd century and is embellished, because literally in the Gospel of Peter at the empty tomb, Jesus walks out. It says that he's as tall as the clouds, so he's like a giant that like is in the sky. And then it says that the cross walks out of the tomb behind him and talks. That's what an embellished legendary account sounds like. The Gospels do not sound like that at all.
No, they don't. They're actually very down to earth, and not only that, but they also are very realistic about the flaws of the heroes. I mean, like Peter and the disciples are depicted as being very foolish a lot of the times. And remember, these would be the leaders of the church when these gospels are being written, and so the people writing these gospels are being honest about the flaws of the leaders of the church, these apostles, like Christ's apostles, and they're saying they're showing, yeah, these guys are fallible. They were foolish. Peter denied Christ, and so it's the opposite. Frankly,
this passes the criterion of embarrassment, right? They're giving embarrassing details, which gives us reason to trust that they're being honest.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite of what you would expect for a story that was to be embellished. And I want to also say that the Gospel of Peter that you brought up is rejected by the church. That's not in the Bible, So the Gospels that are grounded and that pass the criterion of embarrassment, guess what? They are in the Bible, and the ones that are clearly embellished and come to us way later are not thought to be credible, and they're not in the Bible, which means Christians care about credibility.
And what's funny too, when it comes to the Gnostic Gospels, and because the Gnostic Gospels, for anyone that doesn't know what that is, there are these later documents that are called Gospels that are written that were not actually written by the people in question. So the Gospel of Peter was not actually written by Peter. It's a 2nd century document that had that name put on it. So just to kind of help people not be confused by it. But whenever the church fathers would talk about the Gospels, the 4 Gospels in the Bible, the canonical Gospels, they would say, we accept these because they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then when they would reject the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, all these fake Gospels, their explicit reasoning was, we don't know who wrote them. We have no idea who wrote them, and they're late, and we have no reason to think that they are correct. And so the earliest Christians did care about validity, like you just said, and historical accuracy.
What's more, outside of the Bible, the evidence is even more lacking. There are no reliable extra-biblical references to a resurrected Jesus at all, period. The earliest non-Christian source that even mentions Jesus is a brief passage in the writings of Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote about 93 to 94 CE.
Let me just drive it home one more time. Imagine saying that there are no sources that saw Lincoln get shot by John Wilkes Booth, who said that John Wilkes Booth didn't shoot Lincoln, right?
Yeah.
Imagine wanting a source that was like, yeah, I was in the theater and I saw Lincoln shoot, or I saw John Wilkes Booth shoot Lincoln, but John Wilkes Booth didn't shoot Lincoln. Like, obviously, if you see Jesus resurrected, then you're going to become a Christian, right? Like, if you see, okay, Jesus was crucified and now here he is in the flesh again, now you're going to now be a Christian. So I don't even know what he's asking for. And I don't think he knows either. It's just frankly ridiculous.
Yeah, and here's the thing too, that's really, really important. We don't have a lot of writing from that time. Again, we've already mentioned this, that we've lost the vast majority of writings from the ancient world. And so when we're talking about contemporary with Jesus, we don't really have that many authors. We have Philo, who is a Jew, but he was writing in Egypt and wouldn't have known Jesus. We have, Suetonius, we have Tacitus, we have Josephus, but they're writing later. They're writing towards the end of the 1st century for the most part. So to say that these guys who are writing like 50, 60 years later would know Jesus and write about Jesus like as a contemporary eyewitness is insane. And then for the reasons you just said, if they accepted the resurrection, they would just be a Christian source. And so then he would call them biased. Kind of like he probably calls the Didache biased or First Clement biased because they're first century sources and they attest to the resurrection, but they're Christians, right? So we don't trust those sources. But I also want to say he's making an argument from silence. And so I really quickly want to talk about why arguments from silence are really weak. So as it turns out, humans are not very good at intuiting what people will and will not mention. There are tons of events in history that are not mentioned by authors that you would expect them to be mentioned by. And there's an article on the philosophy of religion by Timothy McGrew called The Argument from Silence. I highly recommend reading it. It's really, really good on this topic. And you really need to know your sources, right? To assume that a non-Christian source would attest to a Christian miracle is one thing that makes Rationality Rules' Argument from Silence really weak. These are sources that we would expect to not mention the resurrection of Jesus because they're not Christian. Okay, so we would actually expect them to be silent on this. So an argument from silence is typically only strong if you would not expect silence. However, we would expect silence on this point from these secular sources. But then here's the thing, the secular sources we do have in the first century that mention Jesus actually corroborate the things that we have in the New Testament. So, for example, with Suetonius, he mentions that Christian sects were being a nuisance to the Jews, and the Jews were constantly drawing up a ruckus because of Christians, and they were actually expelled from Rome by Claudius because the Jews were making disturbance, quote, at the instigation of Christians or of Christ. And then Tacitus, he records that Christian persecution under Nero was happening because they were, quote, a class hated for their abominations. So the question is, why were Christians being so annoying to the Romans and the Jews in the first century? Well, it's because they were proclaiming to them, hey, you guys crucified the Messiah and he rose from the dead. And so obviously they were being persecuted for this claim. And so again, this points to the honest testimony of the Christians that they were proclaiming this not only to those that believed them, but they were also being a nuisance to their enemies. And there's a quick thing I wanted to talk about here. John Douglas gives some objective criteria for testing a miracle, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but one of his criteria for testing if a miracle claim is trustworthy, the last criteria is a miracle can be doubted if it's allowed to develop without critical analysis. So in other words, if they're in a environment that was not hostile to their miracle claim, we could doubt the miracle claim. However, the Christians are proclaiming the resurrection to the Jews, to the Christians, and as N.T. Wright has pointed out, in a world where basically resurrection was not believed by anyone. And so they were proclaiming like a totally new idea to the world, and they were being persecuted and killed for it. So this is one really good reason to trust what they were saying. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't think so. Let's keep going. That was really well said.
All right.
However, there is no mention of the resurrection, except for in later translations of his work, which scholars, including Christian scholars, agree that it was likely an addition by Christian scribes.
Look, if Jesus really had resurrected and had appeared to hundreds of witnesses as...
Oh yeah, I will say that point he said about Josephus is correct. There is a quote from Josephus where it appears that it was embellished by Christians, so that point should be granted. However, some scholars have tried to reconstruct the original quote from Josephus because most Josephus scholars do agree that Jesus did mention Jesus in this quote. It was just embellished by Christians. And so
Jesus mentions Jesus. You meant Josephus mentions Jesus.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So Josephus does mention Jesus in this quote. And when you try to reconstruct the original, it still does tell us that Jesus existed. He mentions him explicitly. And I think it does mention that a lot of people called him the Messiah. So I'd have to go look at what the exact quote says reconstructed. But Josephus still in this quote, even though it was embellished by Christians later, most scholars do agree that Josephus does actually mention Jesus in that quote still.
Paul claims we would expect.
Oh, yeah. And then there's a second quote by Josephus where he mentions James, the brother of Jesus. And that quote is not embellished. So Josephus mentions Jesus twice. One of them is not embellished at all. And he definitely mentions James, the brother of Jesus, and his martyrdom. And then the second one is the one that is said to be embellished. And again, even in the embellished quote, scholars agree that Josephus did mention Jesus there. Just want to throw that out there for people, just so they know.
Would we not, to find at least some mention of this extraordinary event in the writings of contemporary historians and officials? But there is a glaring absence of any such corroborating evidence. Making things worse for the faithful, Romans were meticulous record keepers, and a resurrected Jewish preacher who attracted a large following would have surely merited some comment. Yet no such records have been found. The lack of any credible extra-biblical evidence for the resurrection is extremely telling. It stretches credulity to believe that the most amazing miracle in history, witnessed by hundreds, would go completely unmentioned by all contemporary writers and leave no trace in the historical record outside of late, biased, second-hand accounts written by early Christians with a vested interest in promoting belief in Jesus' divinity.
Can I say something real quick? So
Yeah.
I want to say this really quickly. Obviously, any historian that didn't actually see Jesus is only going to tell us that Christians are saying that they saw the risen Christ. And that's literally what we have. We have historians saying, hey, there are these Christians who are saying that they saw the risen Christ. So if a historian didn't see Jesus resurrected because they weren't there, they're not going to tell us, oh yeah, Jesus resurrected. They're going to tell us there are a bunch of people who are making a lot of waves telling us that Jesus rose from the grave. And that is exactly what we have. So
Yeah.
he just doesn't know what he's talking about.
And again, he's saying, like, notice what he said. I'm going to rewind it like 5 seconds. He said, the only testimony we have to the resurrection are these biased sources. And all he means by that is Christian sources. It's like, he's
right.
Yeah, let me play it one more time.
Christians outside of late, biased, second-hand accounts written by early Christians with a vested interest in promoting belief in Jesus' divinity.
Yeah, so he's like, all we have are biased sources, and by that he means Christian sources.
I mean, literally, if we're going to take this approach, we would just dismiss every single claim that we don't like from history, because only the biased sources say that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Only a biased source would tell us that he crossed the Rubicon or that he was killed by the senators in Rome. I mean, it's only the biased sources. So we can just dismiss all of those because I don't want to believe that Caesar was killed by senators or whatever nonsense you're trying to get rid of. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, literally, some of these guys were they were skeptics. They didn't believe. Paul was not a believer. He wasn't biased. And then he saw Jesus. And then he's like, oh, now I'm a Christian. So and same thing with James, the brother of Christ. He was a skeptic. And then he saw Jesus. And then he became a Christian. So we have people that were biased the other way who were converted by the evidence. And then we have their testimonies and their witness and their martyrdom. So it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, but Daniel, they're just dirty Christians, and so they can't be trusted. They're just apologists. They're just biased apologists like us,
You can't trust them because they're saying a miracle happened. It must be biased.
All right, let's keep going.
This glaring absence of corroborative evidence outside the Bible is a major red flag that casts serious doubt on the resurrection story. If the gospel account...
Oh yeah, for that part, just go back to, if you guys need a reminder, just rewind the video, and I address why arguments from silence are not good and why his argument from silence in particular is very weak. So this glaring absence of testimony is just not a good argument.
Accounts were reliable history, we would expect to find at least some mention in other contemporary sources. The fact that we don't is most easily explained by recognizing the resurrection as a later legendary development.
Absence of evidence does not equal evidence of absence.
Well, and also it's not a legendary development that was later developed because we have a creed dated between 3 months and 3 years from the death of Christ that is already codified, where the first Christians are saying Jesus rose 3 days later and he died for our sins and that he was seen by X, Y, and Z. So it wasn't a later legendary development, unless you consider 3 months to 3 years a much later legendary development. And 3 months to 3 years is nothing. Give me a break. He just doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. And he's pretty much about to shift gears in the last few minutes of this video. He's basically going to like psychologize us. So What I want to do maybe is listen to like the first 30 seconds of that, and then we can just cut it there because he pretty much makes the same point for 3 minutes, and then we can just kind of wrap it up. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that sounds good. And I'm sorry if you can hear my family in the background, but they're all awake now.
Oh, it's no problem at all. So we'll listen to probably the next minute or so, and then we'll cut it there. So let's just listen to him for a minute.
Not an actual historical occurrence. All right. I've said quite a bit here, and now I want to pivot. What gives? I'm serious. What gives? Why are so many seemingly rational Christians so outrageously gullible when it comes to the resurrection? I mean, they don't apply the same standard to other miracle claims, do they? We don't see them rushing to believe that Muhammad split the moon just because the Quran says that people saw it happen, do we? They are not this gullible when it comes to claims outside.
I'll say one thing about that. First of all, the miracle of the moon is only attested by one source, and also I'm pretty sure that miracle is like written. I want to say like 100 years after the Quran. I might be wrong about that, but there are definitely good reasons to not believe that happened. So
yeah, I mean, once again, he's conflating one thing with something else that's obviously ridiculous, and then he's trying to say, well, this thing over here is ridiculous, and I'm conflating it with this, so they must both be ridiculous, right? Why do you if you don't believe that the moon split in half, why would you believe this? But you can just do that with anything. If you don't believe that the moon split in half, why do you believe that JFK was assassinated? Like, come on, don't be gullible. I mean, it's just rhetoric. It's just empty rhetoric.
Only biased sources talk about that, Daniel. Only people that believe JFK was assassinated believed or wrote about it. So of course,
use gullible.
Yeah.
Side of their faith, and so they have no right to demand such gullibility on our behalf. By applying their reasoning to other religions, the folly of their pursuit becomes apparent. And this brings me to a point that I've been mulling over for quite some time. When I was younger, I often found myself puzzled by the seemingly weak arguments many Christians present in defense of the resurrection. As I've grown, I've considered various reasons for this, but the most convincing explanation I've come across has little to do with the resurrection of Jesus itself. Instead, it's deeply tied to the overarching Christian narrative. You see, Christians are anchored by the belief that dire consequences await those who do not affirm the resurrection and accept Jesus as their savior. This belief isn't just a minor detail, it's a cornerstone of the faith that torment or annihilation awaits non-believers. Therefore, the story of the resurrection needs to be overwhelmingly compelling, leaving no room for doubt, because this is how they justify a supposed loving God inflicting such horrendous punishment on those who don't believe. This necessity transforms the narrative into something that must be defended at all costs, not because the arguments are sound, but because the perceived consequences of disbelief are too grave. And
all right, so I'm probably going to cut it there because we've been going for a while, and he pretty much goes on like this for the rest of the video. He basically just psychologizes Christians and says, we need this to be true because of hell, and because of the doctrine of hell, we have to believe in the resurrection. Otherwise, we are just going to have existential dread and fear of being burned alive for eternity. And so therefore, this is why we believe in the resurrection. So, first of all, I think this is totally irrelevant to whether or not Christianity is true. Whether or not we have good evidence for the resurrection is a completely independent subject to the doctrine of hell. And second of all, he did mention annihilationism. So not everyone believes that unbelievers are going to be tormented for eternity. Like, I personally believe that annihilationism is correct, that unbelievers or those who are enemies of God specifically are going to be killed at the end of on the day of judgment, rather than burned for eternity. And so, I don't think that a fear of eternal judgment or eternal conscious torment is any motivating factor for me. It's really just the evidence. I think it's completely compelling, and so I think that basically everything he's saying here is irrelevant to whether or not the evidence for the resurrection is strong or not. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's completely irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the actual case itself. He's just trying to psychologize Christians in a very uncharitable way. And we could easily do the same thing right back to the atheist and say, well, he's just not looking at the evidence because he just wants to sin. And I think that that's true, but still it isn't actually an argument about the strength of the case. So I think we should just set all that stuff aside and we should focus on the case itself. Is there good evidence for the resurrection? Yes, there is. And he displayed a tremendous amount of ignorance throughout this entire thing. He didn't understand that Paul is relaying a creed. He doesn't understand that Osiris, Horus, Buddha, Mithra, and Krishna are not actually resurrection stories like Jesus is, and that the story of Jesus' resurrection is fundamentally and completely different. He doesn't understand that the only kind of evidence that we could have from that time period is eyewitness testimony. Like that's literally the only kind of evidence we have to know or have an idea of what happened then is testimony itself. So he's basically throwing all of history into the dustbin if he wants to take that approach, which is just completely absurd. And he's not going to do that. So he's being completely inconsistent. And he never gives a goalpost. He never says what evidence he would actually need in order to believe. And since he said, well, eyewitness testimony isn't good, well, I guess there's no testimony or no evidence whatsoever, because that's the only kind we could expect from that time period. So there's no goalpost in sight. We have no idea what counts as an extraordinary claim and how extraordinary it is. We have no idea what kind of evidence would actually meet this extraordinary claim. All we have is his biased take, basically where he doesn't know what he's talking about, and it's a lot of rhetoric. So go ahead.
I personally thought that his video was logically very sloppy. It was filled with rhetoric. It wasn't filled with any substance, but I wanted to try to steelman his argument really quickly and try to give these 3 propositions that I took from his video. And if these 3 propositions were true, he would have a good case. However, as I hope we've demonstrated in this video, at least 2 of these are false, and then the third one is just a weak argument from silence. So we have, number 1, testimony is not good evidence. We've gone over why testimony has to be received as evidence for the ancient world. It basically leads to absurdities to reject this. We would have to reject basically every proposition about the ancient world that we have, because that's how we know most things that we know about the ancient world is through testimony. It would also reduce rationality rules' knowledge to such a degree because, again, testimony is how he learned the English language. So the fact that he can sit in front of a camera and speak English and question the resurrection is because of testimony. So he shouldn't take on a standard that would undermine his epistemology to such a grand extent. And then second, the testimony we have is unreliable.
Well, let me talk about that. I want to add one other thing to that. Atheists, especially like rationality rules, they love to talk about science and scientific experiments, and they aren't doing these tests themselves. How do they know the results of these scientific experiments? Guess what? Testimony. And do they accept the testimony of just one scientist? Well, they would say no. They want a few different scientists at least to corroborate the experiment in different places, and so you get a multitude of people all saying yes, like every time I try to freeze water, it freezes at this temperature or whatever the experiment shows, right? And so atheists do accept testimony. They just care about the type of testimony that it is. Suddenly now it's relevant, right? If it's some kind of crackpot scientist and he's by himself and he does an experiment one time and he says, I got this result, nobody else can duplicate it, then they're going to throw it out, which is fair enough. But in the case of the resurrection, it's not just one crackpot. It's a bunch of guys who had every reason not to believe it. Even the apostles had every reason not to believe it because it completely contradicted their faith going into it. They weren't expecting Jesus to come back from the dead. They were not expecting a crucified Savior. That stuff would have been heresy until they actually saw the risen Christ. So no one had a good reason to believe it. So I just wanted to say we're all accepting testimony as evidence. It's just a matter of what kind of testimony is it.
That was very, very well said, and I totally agree. And I think that the moral of the story on this first point for everyone listening is that you should take what's called the anti-reductionist approach to testimony, which all that means is, again, you should trust testimony unless you have good defeating reasons to doubt the testimony. And for the resurrection of Jesus, we just don't have those reasons. The testimony we have corroborates well with the external attestation, like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, the way that they talk about the persecution of Christians proclaiming the resurrection of the dead and things like this. That corroborates perfectly with what we have. So it doesn't not correspond, or it corresponds with reality, which is one of the defeating reasons. Or also because we have discrepancies in the details and they aren't perfectly cohesive to the point where all the details line up in such a way that you would say, oh, these guys totally colluded and it's untrustworthy. We just don't have good reasons to reject them. And on top of that, they were persecuted. They were killed for their faith. They were pushing out this testimony in a hostile environment against the Jews and the Romans who had just crucified their Messiah. All of these are good reasons to trust the testimony that we have, which I think leads perfectly into the second one. The testimony we have is unreliable. This is also false for all the reasons I just said. Do you have any other things you want to add about the testimony being reliable?
No, I mean, I think that you pretty much covered it, other than we even have the testimony or the lived witness of people that were skeptics and didn't believe it. And then they saw the risen Christ and their lives completely transformed, like James and Paul. So that adds even more of a very strong case, because it's one thing to have the apostles, but then when you have skeptics going in who also completely transform their lives and agree with what's being said, and then they're willing to die for it, I think that's about as powerful evidence as you could ask for, especially from this time period. And nothing else is going to come close.
Yeah, and I'll add one more point. Most skeptics that want to say it's unreliable, the main thing they want to say is that it was embellished over time. But as you've pointed out many times in the stream, we have the creed from 1 Corinthians 15 that was written within months to just a couple years of the resurrection. And so we have evidence, very strong evidence, that the Christians were proclaiming the resurrection from the very earliest days of Christianity. And that matches up perfectly, that creed matches up perfectly with what we have in the Gospels. It says that he was crucified according to the scriptures. He was buried. So we know his tomb location. We know that he was buried in a known location. And then he had post-resurrection appearances. And so the resurrection was being proclaimed from the very earliest days, and that consistency. So from the 30s all the way till even if we date John to the 90s. So from the 30s to the 90s, we have the same story. Jesus was crucified, buried, and then appeared resurrected. That consistency gives us reasons to think that it was not embellished over time, and it is reliable. And then finally, we don't have extra biblical attestations to Jesus' resurrection. Again, I covered pretty extensively why arguments from silence are very weak, and particularly Rationality Rules' argument from silence is very weak, because he rejects all of the attestation we have that is Christian, because he calls it biased. But then all of the non-Christian sources that don't believe in the resurrection, again, they corroborate what we have in the Bible. They corroborate the persecution in the book of Acts, and they tell us that the Christians, they were proclaiming the resurrection, and they were doing it to the face of the Jews, and they were being a nuisance to the Jews and the Romans, and they were being persecuted for their claims. And so all the non-Christian sources we have corroborate exactly what we see in the Bible, which gives us reasons to think that his argument from silence is just incredibly weak and not even worth considering. And an argument from silence on its own just is weak. So like if propositions 1 and 2 here were correct, then the third one would be a great compliment to them. It would be like, oh, we don't have good evidence and we have no external attestation. But on top of that, when this is just by itself and these two are false, this is really weak on its own. And also, I just realized, Daniel, this is going to be kind of funny. He says that testimony isn't good evidence, but then here he's wanting testimony from non-Christian sources. So he's
all over the place.
He's like contradicting him. So I just realized that he's like wanting testimony, but he's saying testimony isn't good evidence. Like he's just
no goalpost. It's just complaining and nitpicking, and they're not interested in setting forth the standard that you could possibly meet, because if they put forward that standard, it's either going to be totally ridiculous or we're going to meet it. It's going to be one or the other. So they're not going to give you a goalpost that you can if they were to actually have to put forward a goalpost, either we'd meet it or it would be absolutely ridiculous and we couldn't know anything about the past. That's how the case for Christianity is. I want to be very clear about that. So that's why they're
strong. I just thought that was hilarious that he's literally contradicting himself. And this is my Steelman version of his argument. It's like, I can't even Steelman it without contradicting myself. That's pretty funny.
It's terrible. It's just rhetoric. And I hope everybody can see how empty the rhetoric actually is once we've peeled away all the little things, the little turn of phrases and the satire and all that nonsense that he's doing. it's just empty, and he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, totally agree. So we're going to wrap up here. Hopefully everyone who's still watching at this point, you guys are clearly interested in these topics. I encourage you to, do all the YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Also, go follow Daniel. Daniel, tell the people where they can find you for anyone that isn't familiar with you.
Yeah, I'm over at Darwin to Jesus on X, formerly known as Twitter. So if you want to go over there and give me a follow, I enjoy talking about these sorts of things. I typically talk to unbelievers, especially atheists, because I used to be an unbeliever. And that's why my name is Darwin to Jesus. And I also have a small YouTube channel with about 1,500 subscribers here on YouTube. And I'm working on that. But making videos is a lot of work, so I need to get back into it. But yeah, if you guys want to come support me, I would really appreciate that.
Yes, and thank you, Daniel, for coming. It's always a pleasure to have you on the channel. We'll definitely have you back again in the future, I'm sure. And everyone, I appreciate that. And I encourage everyone watching, go follow him on Twitter or X if you haven't done so already. Go subscribe to his YouTube channel. I'll put links in the description below. And thank you guys for watching. We really hope that you can see that Rationality Rules' case against the resurrection simply fails. It's really weak. There's nothing more to it to say. And do you have any parting words, Daniel, before we head out?
No, I just want to say that if there's anybody listening that gets upset by people like Rationality Rules and you want us to take a look at it, you can always message us. And this is something that I'm really passionate about. I'm passionate about atheists and winning them to the faith, but I'm also passionate about Christians and helping them to hold on to their faith. And there are great reasons for us to be Christians. There is great evidence. And so if you find yourself hearing something and it's giving you pause, you can always DM me. My DMs are open over on X. And I think Nathan would agree. You can DM him as well and send us what you have and we'll take a look at it. And hopefully we can do a response to that as well. That helps us to create content and it hopefully helps us to bless you as well.
Absolutely. 100% agree. Thank you guys so much for watching this edition of The Epitome. We are responding to Rationality Rules and his case for the resurrection. Do all the YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, comment, share, and we will see you guys in the next one.